There he is. Dan Senor, welcome. Good to see you.
Hey, Hugh, sorry about that little technical glitch.
It happens.
But
It happened.
it happens.
I
Happens to
began.
the best
How
of us.
tough was it to book Minister Gallant, former Defense Minister Gallant?
Well, I've gotten to know him a little bit over the last 16 months. I met him for the first time in January of 25, just a few months after the war started. And I obviously made it clear to him that anytime he wanted to talk to an international audience, we'd be happy to have him on the podcast. He actually didn't do any media interviews in Israel or anywhere else during the entirety of his service as defense minister during the war. He just did briefings, but no, wouldn't do any sit downs because he just didn't think it was appropriate. And then when he left office, I was still in touch with him, and I visited with him in Israel. I visited with him on a couple of visits he made to New York, and he had made a decision he was going to do two big Hebrew language interviews. And I told him, if you want to do a long form interview, I would explore the issues and decisions he had to make in a way I don't think he would do in a 7-minute television interview. And as you can see from the interview we did, he goes deep. So he has a series of these decisions that were made in periods during the war where he wants to go deep. This conversation that we had we recorded on Friday is over an hour, and that was just dealing with 4 days, the first 4 days of the war. And he intends to have a series of these conversations with me, and he thinks it's the only way to really explore these topics.
Now, Dan, in my intro to this conversation, I said it's after midnight, early Friday morning in Israel, but I was going to bet that most of Israel has already downloaded part 1 of Dan Senor's conversation with Yoav Gallant. And I don't want to know your download numbers. I just want to know if I'm right about that. Are people already reacting to you on your text messages? Yeah.
It's yes. The reaction has been extraordinary. I think for a couple of reasons. One, what Yoav, General Gallant, does in this interview is he really takes you behind the scenes. So like you really get a sense of how these decisions are being made in real time in the room in the Kiryat, which is sort of the command center for Israel's war in the heart of Tel Aviv. So there's basically 3 people who have seen all aspects of the war since October 7th. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and then the chief of staff who just stepped down, Herzl Levy. That's it. It's 3 people. And so he really takes you in the room for how these decisions are made, both intra-Israeli government decisions, how he's working with Secretary Austin and the Biden administration, which is interesting. So I think that is, powerful, and people were struck by it. 2, he also provides some counterfactual history, which he lays out a decision he advocated that he was overruled on, but he actually believes would have changed the course of the war. And that's very interesting. And 3, I just don't think people really know him, Hugh. He's not a real recognized in Israel. He is. When you're with him in Israel, he's like one of the most recognized people. But outside of Israel, people don't really know him. So I just think just getting to know this guy, who has had an extraordinary career in Israeli public life and military life, and will probably have a future, people have just been moved by it.
Now, Dan, I told people already, I played 3 minutes of the interview last hour to tease. You're sitting down with me. I think I know what the lead is, but I don't want to bury the lead. What is the lead? I'm saving both Call Me Backs, that's a 2-parter, for Saturday on my long run because I want to listen to them back to back and I don't know Yoav Gallant from Adam. I recognize him, but I've never talked to him. I have talked to Netanyahu. I talk to Oren every week. I talk to Haviv. I talk to you, but I've never talked to him. What's the lead?
I would say there are 2 leads. There's probably more than 2, but the ones that jumped out at me, 3, I would say the most. Here we go. You wanted 1.
Nobody expects 3. The Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. Right. I would say the first is Yoav Gallant argued that on October 11th, so 4 days before October 7th, he had learned of a meeting that was going to be happening in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, among the senior leadership of the entire senior command of Hezbollah, including Hassan Nasrallah. And he believed that by October 8th, Hezbollah had made it clear that it was joining the war. So Hezbollah is already hitting Israel on October 8th. So he basically says, we're in a 2-front war. What Hamas did was awful, but they are actually the weaker enemy. The more dangerous enemy for us is Hezbollah, for Israel. And as he quotes Clausewitz, he says, if you are facing two enemies at two-front war, you expend your energy on the front end against the tougher enemy. At some point, you're going to have to fight both of them, but the tougher one's going to be harder to fight. Get them done early and quick. And he believed that Israel should have moved on Hezbollah right away. And he lays out a plan for how he advocated doing it, which he could never talk about before recent months, which was he knew all about obviously he was very involved with the pagers that blew up and the walkie-talkies. So he had this plan that basically he knew of this meeting that was happening on October 11th in Lebanon. He wanted Israel to strike the location, the Air Force to strike the location where that meeting was happening, kill Nasrallah and all the senior command, and then start taking out all the missile arsenal, the rocket arsenal. So, they had like 200,000 rockets and missiles. And Israel had very good intelligence on where they were, as we now know. So he wanted to take out the senior command and start taking out the Hezbollah arsenal. And he believed once they did that, Hezbollah would say it's time to escalate, and they would have activated their soldiers to invade Israel. Their soldiers meaning they're terrorists. They're terrorists who fight in terrorists. I mean, they are terrorists. I'm putting soldiers in air quotes, and that they would have activated about 15,000 of these terrorists in their army that they had ready to go. Now, here's the key part. This is why he could have never talked about this before. They knew they had 4,000 pagers in Hezbollah. Israel did that had the explosives. They had about 15,000 of those walkie-talkies. The walkie-talkies are bigger than the pagers, which means they carry more explosives, which means instead of just taking someone off the battlefield temporarily like the pagers did, it could actually kill whoever is near the walkie-talkie. They also knew Hezbollah had these army vests, these military vests, with a pocket for walkie-talkies over the heart. So when they go to invade, they grab the vests and they put in the walkie-talkies. So he thought, you go in, you take out the senior command. You go out and you go in and you take out most of the rocket and missile arsenal. Hezbollah says it's on, and we're activating a ground invasion. Hezbollah activates 15,000 of its terrorists to go grab their vests, their guns, and go invade. And then Israel activates the explosives and the walkie-talkies and kills 15,000 Hezbollah fighters. And he basically says with the combination of those three moves, they've removed the threat from the north. This is before Israel's evacuated most of its 60,000 residents from northern Israel. So it would have not been necessary to remove that whole population. It would have basically taken Hezbollah off the battlefield early on, and it would have kept Hamas isolated, alone, and it would have not had the Israeli army distracted fighting two fronts, and the army could then just focus on Hamas in the south.
Dan, I got to take my first break here, and I'll come back during the break. And then I want to hear what the second and the third lead is. I also want to find out your interviewing style. When I interview President Trump or anybody like that, I don't give them counterfactuals. I don't argue. I let them talk. I want to find out what your style is. Because I haven't heard it yet, but I'm going to listen to both part 1 and part 2 of Call Me Back. I've posted the links over at Hugh Hewitt's X account. I encourage you to follow Dan, like, and subscribe to Call Me Back. It's the best podcast on all things Israel. Stand by. I'll be back. I'm back with Dan Senor in the break between our televised and radio broadcast, which I put on YouTube and my podcast. So, Dan, I'm going to save the other two leads for the second part that's heard across the country. Your interviewing style with someone like Yoav Gallant, do you let them talk or do you propose counterfactuals such as, do you know it's all worked out pretty well and Assad is gone, so even though your very good plan, and it was proposed by Michael Oren publicly at the time, and he didn't know about the pagers and the walkie-talkies, or maybe he didn't tell me. But how do you do the interview when you hear something that piques your interest? You just let him go?
My inclination, Hugh, in these situations is to let the guest talk. He is one of the three most consequential leaders in the decision-making behind one of the most consequential wars of our lifetime. I don't need to keep interrupting him. He has a lot to say that he hasn't said, and he's put a lot of thought into what he wants to say. And I challenge him here and there if there's something glaring, but not in a gotcha kind of. I'm not there to debate him. I'm there to he's letting us be a fly on the wall in his decision making. Let's hear what it was like behind those walls, within those four walls. And I did the same. By the way, I had the same approach with Prime Minister Netanyahu. When I interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu last spring, a lot of people, gave me a hard time for not being more confrontational with him. And I said again, he's one of the most important. Love him or hate him, Bibi Netanyahu is one of the most consequential leaders of our lifetime, and he's here to talk, and we should listen. And like I said, if there's something very specific, something very glaring, a couple things with Netanyahu, I challenged him on. But I'm not there. That's not my, like I said, a couple things fine, but I'm not there to do just back and forth. It's to
Dan, one of my catch lines. I've interviewed Donald Trump 30 times in 10 years. And I rarely, I don't think I've ever fact checked. And I'll tell him, I'll insert, I disagree with you on that when we talk, for example, about 2020. And he knows and he rolls on. But my view is it's an interview, not a debate. If we want to have a debate, we'll have a debate. But I don't want to debate the president or the former president or the president-elect or the president again. And when you have Netanyahu or Gallant, you're actually getting history's first draft for you. Is that in your mind? Let him, as much as possible, let him talk.
Absolutely. I mean, when you listen to this, Hugh, he really provides specifics, and really, you really get a sense for what was happening, and why on earth would I want to chop that up and start? Like I said, if he's making like a sort of an advocacy point, and I disagree with it, it's one thing to challenge him or respond, but when he's just doing storytelling about what was happening in the room, I wasn't in the room. He was in the room. So what exactly am I challenging him on? So I feel strongly, you're right. It's a first draft of history. Let the man tell it.
That is completely, we are in complete agreement on how to interview people who make history, not debate history. I'm coming right back with Dan Senor on the National to get the second and third lead. Go to Call Me Back podcast and listen to both of these back to back on Saturday. Stand by. Welcome back, America. Dan Senor is a friend of the program, frequent guest since the war against Israel began on 10/7. And Dan got the scoop of scoops. He got to sit down with former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and talk to him for a two-part interview, which is dropped at his podcast, Call Me Back, to which you should like and subscribe. We got the first lead in part one, Dan. Part two is really just about technique. Well, this is our third and final part. What are the other two leads?
So just before I close the loop on the first one I just addressed, what Gallant argues is, and you can hear it in the podcast, but he basically lays out, had they confronted Hezbollah early, he thinks they could have sliced the war in terms of timeline in half. But I'll let listeners listen for themselves about how persuasive that is. I found it pretty persuasive. The second lead was him talking about his dealings with Defense Secretary Austin and the Biden administration. And you get the early signs. We're going to dedicate. In fact, I spoke to Yoav today, and I thought we were kicking around ideas for, we were talking about that. We're going to do a series of these conversations. And he's talked to me in the past about the U.S.-Israel relationship because he lived it during wartime. And let's just say he has a lot to say about how the U.S. administration tried to manage Israel's war. And you even see in this conversation, because in this conversation, we're just focused on the first 4 days of the war. And even in the first 4 days, you see Gallant trying to persuade Austin to get some munitions that had been pre-positioned in Israel by the U.S. before October 7th, had been taken out to be sent to Ukraine, but they were still in Europe, and he wants them back, and he's got to persuade Gallant. And Gallant's like, "Why?" Austin is saying, "Why do you need all these munitions? You're just fighting Hamas." And he says, "You have no idea what we're fighting. This is the Middle East. Things are going to get hot all over the place." And he was right. And so we start to see the early signs of the U.S. trying to, and he's not happy. Austin is not happy with Gallant when Gallant tells him we're going to get Nasrallah, and then also when he tells them we're taking out Hania. They don't give the Biden administration a ton of warning, but they give him some warning. And Austin and the Biden people are not happy about it.
Oh wow!
And then the other lead is, and we're going to, in future conversations, we're going to get deeper into that topic, just how his dealings with the U.S. And then the other lead, Hugh, and this moved me almost to tears. He goes, I think it was in January of 2025. I think it was then. Maybe it's a little before that. He goes down to the kibbutzim, to those communities in southern Israel that were completely rocked and wrecked by Hamas. and I've been to these kibbutzim, and they're empty, like nobody's there. And he's touring there, and one resident was there, and this woman in Kibbutz Nir Oz, which is a kibbutz where 25%, one out of every 4 residents of the kibbutz, were either murdered on October 7th or taken hostage. I've been there 2 or 3 times, and he's there, and a woman is there who lost 6 members of her family on October 7th, and she confronts him. She walks
Oh.
up to him, and there's someone from the Israeli press there, and they capture the whole thing, and they film this woman confronting him. And we play the video of this woman confronting him in the episode. If you watch on YouTube, you can actually see it. It's one of the most dramatic images I've ever seen of a wartime leader dealing with, the people they're ultimately accountable to, a resident of the country whose life was ruined by Israel's failure to defend these communities on October 7th. And I don't want to get it, I want your listeners to see this or listen to it, but you hear and see in this man as he's responding to this woman like a real leader. I mean, just I can't imagine in a million years being in his shoes during any part of this war, but especially during that moment when he's standing there dealing with a woman whose life was ruined because she believes he and the IDF were not there when her life was turned upside down.
Dan, I'm going to listen to both of these on Saturday as we await for news of whether or not the war is resumed, hostages, that sort of thing. So I would recommend to everyone be informed, whether you love the guy, hate the guy, whatever. It is like talking to George C. Marshall in the early days of World War II, maybe the first year of World War II. Did you yet get to the Concepcia? I mispronounce it all the time.
You pronounce it properly.
Okay, did you get to the Concepcia with him in the air?
No. So just for your listeners, this is the concept. They called it the Concepcia. What Israel had a Concepcia, a concept of why they did not believe Hamas would attack Israel anytime soon, and obviously it was completely wrong, and Israel was completely manipulated by Hamas into believing that a war was not coming. And we did not get into that. We really just focused on the first 4 days. I think we'll do an episode. We're going to do a series of conversations, and one of the ones I think we should do is all the signs that they got wrong before October 7th, which is, that is the Concepcia.
Dan, I appreciate the way you approach your interviews with this, because it's very rare to establish a level of trust that a major historical figure will talk to you at length and repeatedly in order to establish their record, which can be debated. And you've got Prime Minister already talking to you. Do you know when you're going to go back for the next one? And when does part 2 drop? I know part 1's up.
So part 2 we don't have a date yet for part 2. So part 1 is out, and it's longer than our normal episodes. It's about twice the length. So part 1 is out, and part 2 will probably be sometime in March. I'll let you know when we release it. But I think the tempo for now, we're talking about it. I think we're going to probably do one conversation a month for the next few months. We may pick up the tempo. It depends. But as you'll see from this first episode, it's like listening to an audiobook. I mean, it's a real meaty conversation where he kind of takes you through an arc of events and decisions.
I cannot wait till Saturday. I hope that he continues to commit at relatively rapid, but not without the opportunity for you to reflect and revise and extend his remarks. And your question, has it aired on Israeli television, which I think would be obvious? I don't know if they have the rights or you're negotiating for that.
No, they did. So friends of mine who are Israeli journalists, Yonit Levy and Amit Segel and Nadav Ayel, a couple of those names you may recognize from my podcast, yes. They did a Hebrew language interview with him. So the Hebrew language interview ran in Israel. But here's what's interesting. The English language episode is now, even though the Hebrew language interview already aired, and the Hebrew language interview was shorter than ours, but it covers a lot of the same content. But the English language episode is getting a lot of attention in Israel for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is one thing Israeli citizens want from their leaders is partly why Benjamin Netanyahu has been so successful politically, is because they want to know that their leaders can go abroad, make their case, explain themselves, explain Israel's story, explain Israel's dilemmas and challenges in English to foreign audiences. And so they'd never seen Gallant doing this, where he sits down and he can hold his own for a long conversation to a U.S. international platform. So it's the fact that he's doing this and the way he's doing it, taking him out of his normal comfort zone, is actually getting attention in and of itself.
Of course
inside
it would.
Israel.
It's a fourth dimension. It would be like when Melania in California starts talking Slovakian to one of the victims, and everyone reels backwards because it's fourth dimensional communication. So
Right.
that is extraordinary. Dan Senor, thank you. I look forward to listening to it on Saturday, having you back soon, and I hope Saturday, whatever happens on Saturday, I hope it's good. I have no idea what good is, but I hope it's good. Dan Senor can be followed on X at Dan Senor, the Call Me Back podcast, available everywhere. Like and follow it. You'll be happy you did. I'll be right back.